Welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. And this summer has been on fire with legal topics. We have had all of the Supreme Court decisions coming down. Some of them have been quite complicated. Some of them have been pretty funny, considering the Jack Daniels case. But today, what we want to talk about is we want to reach the overarching matters. We've got a lot of things going on within the states regarding transgender care legislation, drag show issues that are happening, especially in the state of Tennessee, and then the hot part, not that that's not hot enough, but we also have some really hot topics that are coming up continuously, and we're finally going to talk about them today, of judicial ethics, especially with regard to Alito and Thomas, Justices Alito and Thomas, and then continuing arguments about, and I'm going to terribly mess this word up, but the politicization, something like that. Okay. There we go. Of the Justice Department, that both sides are claiming on the political realm. So legally, we're going to get into that, how the legal aspect of it, what the legal aspects are, how each is affected by the legal system, the Constitution, and that sort of thing. And I am Virginia Tehrani. I am with Tehrani Law LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. And we are hosted specifically by the Law Unscripted, which hosts these podcasts, as well as bar preparation, mock trial support, and law student examination help. But we are joined by the illustrious Dr. John R. Weil from Middle Tennessee State University. He is the Dean of the Honors College, and he is an expert. He's a scholar of the Constitution, the Amending Process, constitutional law, the Supreme Court, the Founding Fathers, the list goes on. Now, I'll include his biography in the description below, but Dr. Weil, thank you for joining us to talk about the 2023 Supreme Court and the hottest issues.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm afraid I talked quite a bit, but welcome. Thank you for coming back. It's been lovely to have you.
Good.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit more because it is the Legal Weekly Wine. But for those of you who have watched this, you've learned that Dr. Weil is not drinking wine with us. He is drinking his water, which may turn into wine. So cheers. But on our side, we're going to try another wine. So this is another one from finewine.com, one of our local little stores, wine shops in the Rio in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And one of their experts, wine experts, helped me pick this one out as something that I might like that's different than the normal Cabernets that I tend to lean towards. So today we are going to try a Sangiovese. This is the bottle. It is a Toscana Caparzo. It is an Italian wine, as I understand it. I'll put it in the description if I didn't get it right. But we will show the bottle and have a link for you to find the shop as well as this wine if you're interested in it. And it is a 2020, product of Italy. Here we go. So I'm going to do a quick taste. Cheers, Dr. Weil, to the episode. It's a little bit of a bite. It's smooth, but there's a back bite on it. So maybe the more that I drink, the better it will be. I am more of a cab.
Drink the whole bottle, you won't feel anything.
Right, it'll be lovely. It will be. So I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not my normal taste. And there does seem to be a bit of a sour bite to it. So we'll see what a couple more sips do. But it's not bad. It's just not my favorite that I've had. So, all right. So let's get into, and where do you want to start? You're the one who...
I don't know. I don't know why I raised any of these topics. Let's start. Hot. Let's start with the drag shows.
Okay.
I've never been to one. So I'm probably the most ignorant person on the planet to talk about them. But I do have a great story, which you know already.
Please do.
It's embarrassing. Usually these are the kind of faux pas that my wife makes.
Right.
But I was probably 2/3 of the way through a class in constitutional law. And I can't remember
that you were teaching.
It may have been Barnes versus Glenn Theater, or it may have been another one. But the issue had to do with whether the degree to which the state could regulate nude dancing. And I got about 2/3 of the way through, and somebody raised their hand, and he said, "Dr. Weil, I think you mean G-strings and pasties, not pastries." And he was right. The state had tried to regulate nude dancing by requiring at least some minimal coverage.
Of pasties.
Yes, pasties. And who knows how many minds I corrupted by using the word pastries. But nonetheless, we got it straightened out before the end. But
the visuals are fantastic.
Yeah, I know.
Do you choose which Danish do you choose?
Exactly. In any event, that case is actually, or that series of cases is actually relevant. The court did uphold the right to require this bare minimum, I guess you would say, of coverage. And it did uphold the right for reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. But it also, and Justice Scalia, by the way, thought this part was nonsense, but it did decide that nude dancing was expressive and thus fell under the First Amendment.
The freedom of speech.
Yeah, freedom of speech, and often freedom of speech and press are generally sort of classed under, well, we know, symbolic speech, for example, burning a draft card, which the court has ruled Congress may legislate against, burning a flag, which they basically said, you can't do it over a stick of dynamite or in certain circumstances. But if you're burning a flag in protest, no matter how repulsive people might find that to be, it is a form of expression. You're stating that you're opposed to the nation, presumably because of some policy that you're opposing.
Right.
And I think I think that ultimately many of these drag show cases will come down to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Can you bar them from a public park? Maybe. And of course, so much of this, could you, now this is trickier, could you bar a parent from bringing a child to a drag show? I would think maybe not.
Oh, interesting.
Not the decision that I would make. But and again, part of this comes back to the issue, which I think we've mentioned in a previous show, which is to what degree are the parents in control? To what degree is the state in control? And who determines what is in the best interest of the child, or general? I mean, I think many of these, the notion is if they are anywhere in public, could you have a drag show in an arena,
right,
where people were carded according to age, or
right,
where you could be reasonably sure that no child was there unless their parent had brought them and was with them. And
I guess it depends on I'm not as familiar with the legislation that's being passed as you are, but to me, it would almost depend on what is happening at the drag shows. Is it more of a new dancing type of thing, or is it just the fact that it is a show? Is a particular part of the performance that's being objected to, or is it just because it is drag queens that it is a performance?
You're certainly familiar with the Miller test. There are many states, including Tennessee, I believe, have tried to outlaw drag shows, or at least public ones, in the notion on the basis that they're obscene. And they're not likely to win on that ground, because obscenity, now, the court has said that obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. It's an exception, but it's gone on basically to establish, typically they use what's known as a three-part Miller test. Does the work taken as a whole does it appeal to a prurient or lustful interest? Does it violate contemporary community standards? And does it lack all redeeming social, political, artistic, scientific value? And many of the people who perform in drag shows, as I understand it, consider themselves to be performer.
Artists.
I mean, they are performers.
Yeah.
They consider themselves to be artists and are perceived as such by their audience. So, many of them, and again, I haven't been, so I'm not the best to comment on this, but, many of them are I think they are to a degree making a statement which says gender categories are not quite as clear as simply male and female.
Right.
There are variations in between. You don't need to be as uptight about sex. It's more I don't know, comedic is quite the right.
And a lot of them are, though. But, a lot of them are comedic. They're musical in nature. Some of them are very sexually explicit. Some of them are very sexually suggestive. But how many other comedy shows are? I mean, let's take a look at live comedians and how much worse or better are they than
although again in most of those cases, probably the audience is restricted. I mean, am I right? Most comedy shows or not?
Not usually. They're usually only restricted in terms of alcohol. So if they're in a performance, as I understand it, if they're having a performance at a place where alcohol is being sold,
minors can't be there.
Then there's restrictions on minors. But I don't know that there's really any more, because I mean, you see on TV and all of these live comedians and, recorded, mostly I'm seeing the recording of the live comedian, but
although again, many of them are in different hours typically, right? They're more likely to be after 10 o'clock.
Well, again, that's true.
So there is, now again, it's a different medium, so it's not an identical issue. But, it looks like, again, if I had to, just looking at the preliminary, and I don't think the Supreme Court has gotten to this, but the cases at the state level seem to be indicating you can't just say all drag shows are obscene and outlawed. And, there is a difference between an individual who chooses as an adult to go to such entertainment than there would to displays that are in public. We have, to take the most obvious, we have public exposure laws, right? If you parade around nude in the public, you can be arrested. I'm not saying that all drag shows are in the nude, but
but that's the thing, is usually it has to be nudity, and just because they're they're clad in less clothing, I don't know a better way to say it, it doesn't mean that they're indecent.
Right.
Because there are a lot of people who can walk around and, as long as you're not naked, then the indecency laws don't necessarily apply. So I think the idea is that states are targeting them as a class of people versus a class of entertainment.
That's sort of the equal protection clause. Now, the other argument is, and it's maybe getting too complicated, but I contribute regularly to our First Amendment encyclopedia at MTSU.
Absolutely.
And there's something called a major principle in First Amendment law called content neutrality, which is, if you're going to open the door for legislators and others to criticize drag shows, then those who say, well, I think there's some redeeming social value, then they have at least a right to be heard. And certainly this could be enhanced perhaps by this isn't really, this isn't anything to be afraid of. I pretend to be a woman, I go back to my husband or whatever, or to my wife or whatever.
Well, and I guess one of the larger questions or twofold questions is right now, as I understand it, transgender or gay or any of the other applicable terms, they are not protected as a class. They're not in one of the protected classes currently defined in the Constitution.
Well,
and would they be? Could they be?
I think you may be wrong there.
Okay.
I believe there is a case within the last year or two which has said that transgender is in fact considered a classification based on sex.
Okay.
Which is, so I need to, if I had
then
my,
I definitely need to look that up.
If I had my essential Supreme Court cases that I compile, I could turn right to it, but I don't have that in front of me. But I believe the court has interpreted the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, to include transgender. I'm not absolutely positive of that, but I'm fairly sure. And in fact, probably if you have a way of adding a note to this, we could probably look up the specific case and follow.
Okay, it looks like we're close on it. So yes, yes and no. It looks like this is 2020. Civil Rights Act protects LGBT employees from workplace discrimination, protects gay and transgender workers from employment discrimination.
That's I believe that's do you have the name of it? I'm embarrassed that I don't remember it, but
oh goodness, I'm the one who said it wrong completely. Let's see what this one is. Where's the name of it?
Again, it's partly statutory interpretation.
Right. And it does say prohibits sex discrimination, applies to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity.
Right.
So they have been, and I am trying to figure out where the actual case name is. And I apologize. So what it seems like is, I am not up to date, that they have been considered as a protected class.
Well, again, even sex is not quite as protected as race is.
Right. It's the second tier, right?
Yeah. It's, strictest scrutiny, maybe not, but probably intermediate scrutiny, particularly for sex and gender. And probably that's where this would fall. So that there is some court protection for it.
It looks like it was two: Bostick versus Clayton County, Georgia, and Altitude Express Inc. versus Zarda. Yeah,
Bostick is the one that's usually I think that was the lead case of the two.
Okay. Sorry on that. Well, I should have known better if I'm talking about it.
My ignorance here too.
Okay, so we're thinking in the terms of the classifications for people who don't know, there are different reviews depending on what type of class it is. So if it's race, it's strict scrutiny.
Right.
And gender and sex
generally requires what's called a compelling interest. The only racial
make it,
right. To discriminate against race, you'd have to have a very, very compelling reason. And maybe we saw an example of that in one of our earlier broadcasts where we talked about the Native American adoption.
That's what I'm wondering.
Strict scrutiny would suggest, typically you would say, well, you didn't consider race, or at least it wouldn't be predominant. But when it comes to Native Americans and tribal identity, particularly given the past history, it might be that you could make a strict scrutiny argument and still uphold giving the preference to other Native Americans. Mm-hmm. But you have that, then you have intermediate scrutiny, which I think you were getting to.
Right. And that is where you're saying it is a protected class, or sex and gender are protected classes, but they fall under the intermediate scrutiny. And what is the burden there of proof So to
Well,
speak.
it's more than, if we go to the third one, it's sort of a rational basis.
Mhm.
And that's most typically used. It's sort of developed after the 1937, the switch in time that saved nine, where the
Okay.
court had been previously striking down a lot of economic legislation, and it decided no, as long as they give a rational, something that you wouldn't laugh out loud at, we're not going to examine them with the same degree of scrutiny. The intermediate scrutiny, there's some magic words that just escape me right at the moment.
Yeah,
but
I can't remember
yeah,
them either.
somewhere in between. But
Okay.
I would say right now, if you go back, this isn't new. If you go back to the ERA adoption,
Okay.
one of the reasons that it was stymied, they got up to 35 out of 38 states.
And tell everybody what that is.
I'm sorry.
The ERA adoption. Tell
right,
everybody
the Equal
what that
Rights
is.
Amendment. Right. The proposed Equal Rights Amendment almost got ratified. And then Phyllis Schlafly, among others, a very conservative layperson, began raising questions, largely dealing with bathroom issues. What does this? Does this mean that men could use women's bathroom and vice versa? And the trans seems to be the issue du jour,
Mhm.
where for most of us, I mean, frankly, I know more of trans people than I'm actually know in person.
Right.
But I think for many people, anything that tears down, this long-standing distinction between male and female seems scary. And so,
yeah, it does scare a lot of people. They
does.
don't know what to do with it.
And in fairness, there's probably, if you think about it, would anyone wish, would anybody say, I'd like to join the other, I'd like to switch sexes just because I'd like to do it? And if a lot of people did that, I guess, we could be in trouble. If you had, it'd be hard to repopulate the earth, that sort of thing.
Of course.
But, what we're dealing with, as I understand it, is maybe 1 in 100 people. I think the correct term, psychological term, is gender dysphoria. People who apparently from an early age say, I may have male anatomy, but I feel like a female, or vice versa.
Right.
And a lot of the questions, so, those, if you think this is the beginning of a tsunami, I mean, then for one thing, it's very expensive. This requires years of hormonal therapy, often requires surgery, requires transitioning, to friends and people who know you, your employers.
It's not something that I would go into happily or
no, I mean, it's and you would think, a typical parent, if you had come to me as a child and said, I really feel like a boy, I'd probably have shrugged my shoulders and say, well, of course you do. You like the outdoors, so do boys. Don't worry about it. Or vice versa. If I had a son who said, I like to play with dolls, I might have thought a little odd, but I'd probably say, okay, do it. That doesn't mean you're a girl just because you want to play with dolls. But I think for many people, the notion that, people could be switching, and again, the stakes are high.
Yeah.
Either way, that they're apparently, a lot of people who have, if I'm using the right term, dysphoria, gender dysphoria, they are apparently more suicidal, more depressed.
Well, what a hard place to be.
It would be a very difficult place to be.
It's not easy. It's something I wouldn't go into lightly.
Well, it's not dissimilar. There are parallels between, families that reject children who are gay. But that doesn't usually involve, actually changing changing the shape of their bodies. So this I think seems even more, threatening to a lot of people. And I really don't know. And then let me add, to this is added some, what I guess are fairly rare cases, but are fairly striking cases of someone who is in the process of changing genders who then switches sports teams.
Right.
And
I think that's one of the bigger cries right now.
To the extent that one, if you look back, much of the progress since 1964 has not only been in racial equality, but it's also been in gender equality. Mm-hmm. And if all of a sudden, now it's hard for me to believe that many men are going to become women just in order to compete against women and beat them. But
you would hope not.
Right. I mean, there would certainly still be a legitimate question. Do you have an unfair advantage because you had, 15 years of testosterone while the other opponents had estrogen? So there's some, and there are issues going back to, what I think was largely the red herring of the ERA, the women's bathroom. There would be genuine concerns about, if you have a daughter who's exposed to someone, in the shower with male body parts,
of course,
who's transcending, that would be embarrassing, I think, for many people, particularly the younger they were. So there's some genuine issues here, but part of the question with what's happening now is a lot of states, including Tennessee and Florida, Governor DeSantis has gotten a lot of mileage out of this, trying to ban what's known as gender affirming care. That's a loaded term. As almost every term that's used in this area is. But, he basically says this is a decision that's so consequential that it shouldn't be made until someone is an adult. Mm-hmm. The problem is, as I understand it, for some people, the transitioning into, from child to adult, which is already fairly traumatic for many of us, becomes even more so.
Exactly.
In these cases. And so it's a little bit like the abortion issue. Is it a matter for the state? Or is it a matter, in this case, generally, I would say, rather than a woman and her doctor, it would be, is it a matter for the parents and the child and the doctor to decide? And, even that is, I'm making it easy because what if there's, in fact, a conflict between what the child wants and what the parents think are best?
Right. And,
they may be as motivated. I mean, you would hope that they would care a lot about the welfare of their child, but they might also be concerned about what do people at church think? What are people at work going to think? I must be a bad parent if I didn't model what a man is, and my son wants to become a daughter, then maybe that's on me. So
it's a question of themselves.
Yeah. So, it's a highly political issue.
Yeah. It's got to get to the court at some point between the drag cases as well as the transgender care. It's going up. It's just a question of when.
Yeah.
And who.
And again, I don't know what would happen if you just left this to parents and children and doctors to decide. Might we be better off? You have plenty of people on both, not plenty of people. I think there's literally like 1 out of 100 who generally has this. And, of those, I'm sure probably many of them say, well, I may be uncomfortable with the sex I have, but it's a lot easier than going through surgery and having to explain to people I'm just going to live with it.
And I mean, I think the question in this is the state interest, right? What is the state interest in protecting these children? And is it a question many states would say, well, our interest is protecting them against this.
Right.
Whereas other states would say, well, our interest is protecting them to have this option. So I
Right.
think there's a split as to what is the interest of the child by the state,
And
and
as
would
I
that go
understand
against
it,
the parents?
right, there are also degrees here. I mean, as I understand it, some of the treatments are basically puberty blockers,
Right.
which don't initially change one's gender, but simply avoid the transition to puberty a little bit
Yes.
longer for people to straighten, in their own mind to figure out what, where they are,
Right.
as opposed to, fairly radical surgery. And you do, there are cases that I have read, testimonies, if you will, of people who say, well, I thought I would be happier as a man, and lo and behold, men have problems too, or vice versa.
Well, but then there's the case of Elliot Page, who's extraordinarily happy with his transition. All right, so the next topic we want to hit, and I know we're going to be watching over the next year about the transgender issues, the drag shows. We'll try to keep the Legal Weekly Wine updated as well. But thanks for bringing that topic into the Legal Weekly Wine. I know a lot of people are really interested in it, as they are also interested in the legal ethics issues going on in the Supreme Court. What is happening?
Well, generally, and I think this repeats a little bit of what we said earlier, but, there's a charge right now that the Justice Department has been weaponized. And, Republicans are saying, it's not fair that Hunter Biden apparently is going to have a plea deal, whereas Trump is Biden and Pence, of course, Pence is a Republican, but right. Biden doesn't appear as though he's going to be prosecuted for having top secret materials, whereas they're going, full circuit against Trump. And, we saw this with the recent attempt, I think it's only the third time in this century or in the last 100 years that Congress has censored one of its members. And what are they censoring for? Not for, having sex with a page or the typical things that one might right. think of, but for, holding trying to conduct an impeachment against the president. And of course, Republicans think that, the two impeachments of Trump were unfair. And so what do? They decide at least that, let's try to impeach Biden. So there's a lot of distrust right now, and a lot of it is, some of the people know better, and they're just simply, but I think the public is genuinely confused. The great sort of irony here is that for generations, particularly the Republican Party, it was always, the party of law and order. And it was, they were the ones, even if the FBI sometimes tapped your phone or, did something that was a little unseemly, they're fighting against communism, we're for them. And now, you expect a little bit of conflict between the branches, but right. It's generally between the executive and the legislative branch. And now what we have is a lot of members, and actually it's from both parties. Take this example, the judge right now, the district judge, I guess, who's overseeing the Trump
down in Florida,
the Trump charges. There are a lot of Democrats who are saying, well, she can't possibly be fair. She's a Trump appointee. Now, they also have a court case that they can point to where she was overruled rather authoritatively, which suggests that she might be a little bit out of the mainstream. But, Chief Justice Roberts, to his credit, and I don't think anybody believed him, but, what he said is that we don't have Republican and Democratic judges. We have U.S. judges,
That's what it's supposed to be.
Right. I mean, the robe is supposed to mean something. And, it becomes increasingly hard not to consider partisan considerations because most recent appointments have been very partisan in nature. I mean,
yes,
Trump basically said, I'm going to appoint, for many years, Republicans and Democrats both said there's not going to be a litmus test. But frankly, Democrats often have used, we're only going to appoint pro-choice judges. And Republicans have responded, well, we're only going to appoint pro-life. And then it's hard to say, well, they went through this confirmation and someone made prompt, in the case of abortion, a number of these justices had said, we're going to follow precedent. Now, in fairness, they can say, well, we followed the precedents prior to Roe versus Wade.
Right. The original precedents is the idea.
Well, and they were more, that wasn't so much the Supreme Court deciding it as the Supreme Court leaving it to the states.
Right.
But, we're going to be in trouble if people believe that most judgments are made not on the basis of the law or the Constitution, but simply on the basis of party identification. So it's a real problem that we have right now.
Well, and even with the party, on top of, forget the political parties, now we've also got the ethical issues regarding use of monies and gifts and declarations of these. I know more about Thomas, but what is coming out about Alito now?
Well, Thomas, of course, is accused of, he has a friend, and people have friends, right?
Absolutely.
You don't expect them to give that up, but, friends sometimes use friends. Friends sometimes establish friendships in order to gain leverage. And in his case, apparently one single vacation that he took to Indonesia, involved a yacht.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I think they estimated as much as 500. And there were private plane trips from the yacht to different locations. Alito seems to be a little less pervasive, but apparently, but maybe is consequential because the allegation is that, which I don't think he's denied, that he had a very nice fishing trip sponsored by a billionaire to Alaska that I think they estimate would be maybe $100,000 if he had to rent his own private plane to get there and whatever. And what's a little more troubling, if true, is that the person who sponsored that trip has in fact had a number of cases. Now, they're not under his name, but they involve businesses that he owned or was associated with. And, one of the things that you learn, or I hope you learn, I don't know as much for attorneys as it is for judges, but the standard rule for judicial ethics is you not only avoid, let's back up a minute. Mm-hmm. I doubt seriously that George Soros could take Thomas on a trip that would change his mind on any issues.
He does seem pretty set.
Yeah,
it doesn't seem to be a surprise
because you're associating with people of your own persuasion doesn't mean that you're voting for their interests because they've given you a gift. But the traditional rule has been, understanding is, judges avoid not only evil, but they avoid the appearance of evil.
The appearance of impropriety.
Right. That's right.
Got to avoid it.
And this becomes, what is tricky in this case is apparently neither justice has either the rules aren't clear or they have not followed the common understanding of registering that they have accepted the gifts. And usually cover up is a sign or is taken as an indication, if you didn't have anything to hide, why have you,
why would
kept
you not declare?
public?
Yeah.
And
What rules do apply as far as the gifting? What are they bound under in order to disclose?
and here,
Is it IRS
to tell you the
precedent?
truth, I don't know that I have. I think what's happening is I think there has been sort of an informal understanding of what, my understanding is the court has largely set rules for itself. Well, clearly what's going to happen, speak now as a political scientist rather than a lawyer, is if you don't police your own house, somebody else is going to come in. And,
they'll do it for you.
I mean, we have this with this tragic case. And it sounds like, this submerged vehicle was visiting the Titanic. It sounds like, as of the day that I'm speaking, that, that it probably imploded and everybody is dead. But as I understand it, it was in international waters. And if it were a submarine, there would be rules to govern, if it were this or that, the Navy would have control, but it's not. And if you have, if they've in fact died, even if they haven't, if they weren't able to, to see them have communication, then some entity is likely to step in and say, we're going to establish some rules here to protect. And this is why, I have a fair amount of respect for Chief Justice Roberts. I think he has really tried, when he was being confirmed, his ideal, which is maybe everybody's ideal and perhaps unrealistic, but was, we are here to umpire. We're here to call the balls and the strikes. We're not here to run the bases or to pitch the ball.
I think that's the whole idea of the Supreme Court, and that everyone's supposed to have, is that they're not the legislative
that's the idea.
body.
And of all judges. And I think, even and again, I would give a little bit of caution. It's like campaign money. You can't say necessarily that because somebody took $1 million from name the organization or the person, that they're going to be beholden to them.
Right.
Because often what happens is, if you're pro-gun rights, then the NRA is going to give you money. If you're, pro-life, then you're going to get pro-life groups are going to give you money. And you Democrat, you're going to get money from Democrats. And of course, a lot of businesses do to hedge their bets, and they give to both sides.
Right. Well,
but you can't just,
I think the other question is of recusal, is with that appearance of impropriety is, okay, well, maybe it was fine for me to do that, but let me step out of this case that involves an interest that they're in, so that it doesn't appear that I'm biased.
Right. And of course, again, Alito is saying this man's name never appeared. And maybe that, a lot of people don't discuss politics when they fish, right? They fish. They're going fishing, so they don't have to talk about it. So, and
hopefully the justices don't. I mean, the idea is that they don't go around talking about politics because of their position.
And if Justice Thomas talks to his wife, I don't know what they talk about if they don't talk about politics, because she's very, very actively engaged.
Very political.
Some of the other justices are too. But
that's the other part of the ethics, is how much bleed over do spouses have? And is her portion, is her position, are her views supposed to be attributed to him because they're a married couple? Is there any way to fully divide?
Well, and there's sort of women's rights actually sort of works on his behalf, right? Yeah. He's not necessarily responsible for her views, may not even share them. I mean, she is
her own woman.
Yeah. So it's kind of so like most aspects of the law. It's very complicated.
It is. Oh, goodness. Well, I really appreciate you talking about all of these issues that in this little special session that is truly hot topics, but continuing hot topics as we go through the Supreme Court year of 2023. Is that the best way to say it?
22. Well, it's actually the 22 session, which goes into 23.
Well, that is interesting.
Yeah.
I forget that it technically is the cases from 2022, but
and I guess all your readers know this, right? But there's nothing much more accessible than Supreme Court decision. I mean, if you have a copy machine or you don't mind reading online, you go to, just type in U.S. Supreme Court and they'll get you to the site. And then you go to opinions and they list them, the most recent. And you can just, that's what I almost every day during the season, open up, see if there are any new decisions and at least try to scan them and get a view. So, it is, they used to say the beauty of the Supreme Court was they were the only people who did their own work and that they have to give reasons for their decisions. And that's why court opinions appeal so much to scholars. But interestingly, I have found something that's comparable that most scholars have not delved into, which is the Constitution requires that when a president vetoes a law, they have to give reasons for their veto. And so I'm hoping to sell a book on this. I have it written and just waiting for somebody. But one of the things that fascinated me about it is the way that we always attribute rationality to the court. They have to pro or con. They have to give you a decision and they have to explain it. But presidents do the same thing when they do vetoes. And often, by the way, particularly when it comes to private bills, which are rarely used anymore, they use the same language. Equal protection. We got to treat this equally. This is fair. This is due process or not. And so it's a whole area where, someday I think there may be case books of presidential vetoes.
Interesting.
I would be the obvious person to write it, but in any event.
Well, somebody pick it up because it's extremely interesting. And thank you for being here. Thank you for walking through the season with us and providing your expertise, your humor, your interesting facts, and your opinions. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, we will catch you on the next Legal Weekly Wine. We hope you grabbed your own glass of wine and had a wonderful happy hour with us on the second season of the Legal Weekly Wine.